The blue ribbon felt impossibly heavy in Agnes Parker's calloused hand, its satin edge cool against her skin. From across the dusty fairgrounds, she watched Franklin Sterling stare at her prize-winning tomatoes, his face a perfect picture of disbelief. The light of the late afternoon sun caught the polished dome of his head, making him look like a man whose own thoughts were too bright, too hot to bear. He didn't know yet. He didn't understand that the 6 magnificent, crimson globes sitting on a bed of clean linen were his own creation, born of his arrogance and his refuse. He was the architect of her victory and his own comeuppance, and the irony of it was a quiet, sturdy thing inside her chest. But that came later. Months later. The story, her story, began not with a blue ribbon, but with a smell. It was the smell of the ocean turning sour, of life giving way to decay, and it arrived on a hot Tuesday in June, carried on the wheels of a rickety wagon that bucked to a halt at the edge of her property. Her husband, Arthur, had been in the ground for just over a year, and the silence he left behind was still a physical presence in the small farmhouse. The farm itself, 30 acres of stubborn clay and rock, was all she had left of him. That, and his old spade, its wooden handle worn smooth as river stone by his hands. The wagon driver, a man she didn't know, avoided her eyes. Mr. Sterling's compliments, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he tilted the wagon bed. A cascade of fish heads, guts, and silvery scales slid onto the fallow ground of her back field, a grotesque offering that shimmered in the heat. Her old hound, Buster, let out a low growl from the porch, the fur on his spine ridged with alarm. The driver was already climbing back onto his seat, eager to be gone. The stench rolled over her, thick and oily, a violation of the clean, dry air. It was the smell of disrespect. The next day, Franklin Sterling arrived himself, his buggy kicking up a plume of dust that settled on her wilting porch hydrangeas. He was a man built of soft living and hard bargains, the owner of the new, prosperous fish market in town, a venture that was quickly swallowing up the smaller merchants. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the stinking pile in her field. A simple business proposition, Agnes, he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of impatience. He explained that the town council, of which he was a newly appointed and influential member, had passed an ordinance against dumping trade waste within the town limits. His solution was her farm. It was remote. It was, in his eyes, unproductive. He offered her $2 a month to use her back corner as his dumping ground. Not a request. A statement of fact. $2 is generous for an unused bit of land, he added, as if she should be grateful. Agnes looked past him, at the field where Arthur had tried for years to grow corn, fighting the unforgiving soil until his heart gave out. Unused. The word stung. She thought of the mortgage payment, of the dwindling sack of flour in the pantry. She felt the familiar clench of powerlessness. "And if I say no?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sterling's smile was thin. "The wagons will come anyway." This just makes it neighborly. It was extortion, plain and simple. He knew she had no one to fight for her, no money for a lawyer. She was just a widow on a poor patch of land. She looked at his polished boots, then back at her own worn leather shoes, scuffed and cracked from work. A memory surfaced, clear as a bell, Arthur, leaning on his spade, wiping sweat from his brow. "The earth remembers, Aggie," he used to say. "You give it good, it gives you good back. You give it bad." He'd never finished the thought. Agnes met Sterling's gaze. A tiny, hard kernel of an idea began to form. "All right, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice finding a steadiness she didn't feel. $2 a month, he nodded, satisfied, already turning back to his buggy, the matter settled. He saw a defeated old woman. He didn't see the farmer. The work was brutal. Each week, another wagon arrived, disgorging its foul cargo. The pile grew, a monument to Sterling's contempt. The flies came in biblical clouds, and the smell was a constant, oppressive weight that clung to her clothes and hair. Some days, it was all Agnes could do not to hitch up her own wagon and abandon the farm altogether. Her daughter Sarah's letters from the city were full of pleading. "Sell the place, Mother. Come live with me." There is no dignity in this. But dignity was a funny thing. Agnes was finding it not in surrender, but in the handle of Arthur's spade. She started by digging. Around the festering heap, she dug a shallow trench, defining its borders. Then she began the process of turning it. She'd drive the spade into the slick mass of heads and bone, heave, and flip it over, exposing a new layer to the sun and air. It was nauseating work. Buster would watch from a safe distance, whining softly, his sensitive nose offended. Her neighbor, Jed, a gruff, solitary man who'd known Arthur since they were boys, rode over one afternoon, his face a mask of concern. "Agnes, what in the good Lord's name are you doing? The whole county can smell it." She just wiped a sleeve across her sweaty brow. "Farming, Jed." He stared at the pile, then at her. "That ain't farming. That's a crime against nature." But he saw the set of her jaw. He came back the next day with a wagon load of straw from his own barn and a younger man in tow. "This here is Leo," Jed said. "He needs work. And you need help." Leo was wiry and quiet, with hands that looked like they knew their way around a shovel. He didn't flinch at the smell. He just picked up a pitchfork and looked at Agnes, waiting for instructions. Together, they began to build the pile properly. A layer of fish, a layer of straw, a layer of manure from her single cow, a layer of dirt. They built it like a giant, layered cake. It was a compost pile. Arthur had always talked about it, about feeding the soil the way you'd feed a prize hog. "Waste is just food in the wrong place," he'd said. "The earth remembers." The phrase became her mantra, repeated with every shovelful. The seasons turned. Summer bled into a crisp autumn, and then a hard, frozen winter. The wagons from Sterling's market kept coming, though less frequently as the cold slowed the fishing. The great pile in the backfield froze solid on the surface, steaming faintly on the rare sunny mornings. Agnes, Leo, and Jed spent the winter months planning. They pored over seed catalogues by the light of a kerosene lamp in Agnes's small kitchen, the scent of baking bread a welcome counterpoint to the lingering odor outside. Leo, who had a knack for drawing, sketched out a plan for the vegetable garden, expanding it to twice its previous size. Jed, a carpenter by trade, repaired the fences and built cold frames to give the seedlings a head start in the spring. A quiet partnership formed between the three of them, forged in shared labor and a stubborn refusal to be beaten. Sarah's letters grew more infrequent, her disapproval a silent chasm between them. Agnes wrote back, trying to explain, but the words felt inadequate. How could she describe the strange hope that was taking root in her heart, a hope that smelled of rotten rich soil? She was tending more than just a compost pile, she was tending her own resilience. As the ground thawed, the true transformation began. The pile, which had been a source of shame and disgust, was now a source of power. When they dug into its core, the stench of decay was gone, replaced by a deep, earthy perfume that smelled of life itself. The fish heads and bones had vanished, broken down into a black, crumbly humus teeming with worms. It was beautiful. It was black gold. They spent weeks hauling it by the wheelbarrow load, spreading it thick over the vegetable patch, tilling it into the dense, unforgiving clay that had broken Arthur's spirit. The soil changed color, turning from a pale, tired tan to a deep, promising chocolate brown. It felt different in her hands, no longer clumpy and resistant, but soft and yielding. Agnes held a fistful of it, letting it run through her fingers. The earth remembers. She took out the small, carefully wrapped packet of tomato seeds her mother had given her years ago, seeds passed down through 3 generations of women who knew how to make things grow. She pressed each tiny seed into the enriched soil with her thumb, a silent prayer for each one. As spring warmed into summer, the garden exploded with a life force that felt miraculous. The cornstalks shot up, thick as a man's wrist, their tassels a pale gold against the blue sky. The squash vines, a vibrant, almost aggressive green, snaked across the ground, their broad leaves forming a dense canopy. But it was the tomatoes that were the true marvel. The plants grew into sprawling, unruly bushes, so heavy with fruit that Jed had to build extra trellises to support their weight. The tomatoes themselves were extraordinary, deeply red, with firm flesh and a weight that felt substantial in the palm of your hand. They were nothing like the pale, watery things sold at the general store. The farm, once a symbol of her loss and poverty, was now a place of astonishing abundance. The air was sweet with the scent of tomato leaves and damp earth. Even Buster seemed to sense the change, trotting happily between the rows, his tail held high. People in town started to notice. The wagons that used to race past her property now slowed down, the drivers gawking at the lush spectacle. Rumors began to fly, colored with the usual small-town mix of suspicion and wonder. Some said she'd made a deal with unseen forces. Others whispered that she'd discovered a secret spring. No one connected the vibrant garden with the foul-smelling pile that had offended their noses all last year. Franklin Sterling drove by once, his face a tight knot of confusion. He saw the bounty, the sheer, undeniable success of it, and it clearly irritated him. He couldn't reconcile the image of the defeated widow with the thriving farm before him. The irony was a constant, private source of amusement for Agnes. His waste, his arrogance, was literally feeding her success. It was a truth she held close, a secret that made her smile as she worked. This is the part of any story where you feel the tide turning, where the quiet work starts to pay off. It's a good reminder that sometimes the best things grow from the stuff nobody else wants. If you appreciate stories about finding strength in unexpected places, this might be a good time to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. One sweltering afternoon in late July, the sky turned a bruised purple. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive silence that comes before a storm. Jed, who could read the weather like a book, looked to the west. "This is going to be a bad one, Agnes." "Hail, I reckon," panic seized her. The thought of the hail, like tiny, hard fists from the sky, pummeling her beautiful plants, was unbearable. All their work, all their hope, was staked out there in those neat green rows. There was no time to think. The three of them, Agnes, Jed, and Leo, flew into action. They grabbed every old burlap sack, every spare bit of canvas and tarp they could find. They ran through the garden, draping the fragile plants, securing the coverings with rocks and twine. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall as they worked, and then the wind hit, a ferocious gale that tore at the makeshift shields. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the sky opened up. Rain and then ice cascaded down, a deafening roar on the tin roof of the barn where they finally took shelter, soaked to the skin and gasping for breath. They stood together in the dusty, hay-scented dark, listening to the storm rage outside. They had done all they could. The rest was out of their hands. In that moment, huddled together against the fury of nature, they were no longer just a widow, a neighbor, and a hired hand. They were a family. A strange, cobbled-together family, bound by the soil they worked and the storm they were weathering together. When it was over, an hour later, the world was washed clean and sparkling. A rainbow arched across the sky. They walked out to the garden, their hearts in their throats. The ground was littered with icy pellets, but most of the coverings had held. Some leaves were shredded, a few branches broken, but the precious fruit, the tomatoes and squash and corn, were largely unharmed. They had survived. The shared crisis had burned away any remaining distance between them, leaving behind a solid, unspoken affection. That evening, they sat on the porch and ate a simple meal of bread and cheese, too tired to cook. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They just watched the last of the light fade, content in the quiet company of those who had faced the storm with them and won. It was Jed's idea to enter the state fair. "These tomatoes," he said one morning, holding one up to the light, its skin glowing like a ruby. "I ain't never seen the like." "You've got to enter them, Agnes." She was hesitant. The fair was for serious farmers, for men with sprawling acres and pedigreed livestock. What was she, with her small patch of land reclaimed from ruin? But Leo was insistent, his young face bright with excitement, and Jed was stubborn. Between the two of them, her resistance crumbled. They spent a whole day selecting the perfect specimens. They walked the rows with the gravity of judges, debating the merits of each fruit. They chose 6 tomatoes, identical in their perfection, flawless skin, symmetrical shape, and a deep, uniform color that spoke of sun and rich soil. Leo built a special wooden crate for them, lined with soft cotton from an old quilt, to ensure they wouldn't bruise on the long wagon ride to the capital. The morning of the fair, Agnes put on her best dress, the one she'd worn to Arthur's funeral. It felt strange to be dressing up for something joyful. As they loaded the crate onto Jed's wagon, she felt a flutter of nerves. It felt like she was putting not just her tomatoes, but her entire year of struggle and secret hope on display for the world to see. The fair was a chaotic swirl of sights, sounds, and smells. The air was thick with the scent of livestock, fried dough, and sawdust. People thronged the dusty walkways, their faces eager and animated. Agnes felt small and out of place. They found the horticulture pavilion, a vast, airy building where long tables were laden with the best produce the state had to offer. There were pumpkins the size of armchairs, braids of garlic as thick as rope, and pyramids of gleaming apples. Her 6 simple tomatoes, sitting in their cotton-lined box, looked humble and plain by comparison. She placed them on the designated table, filled out the entry card, Parker Farm, and walked away, feeling sure she had made a fool of herself. She didn't want to watch the judging. The waiting was an agony of suspense. They spent the afternoon wandering the fairgrounds, trying to distract themselves. But Agnes's thoughts kept drifting back to the pavilion, to her 6 tomatoes under the critical gaze of the judges. It was late in the day when they saw the crowd. A large group of people had gathered near the produce tables, their voices a low buzz of excitement. As they got closer, Agnes saw him. Franklin Sterling was standing at the edge of the crowd, a look of profound irritation on his face. He was gesturing to a companion, pointing at the prize table. Agnes's heart began to pound. Pushing her way gently through the onlookers, she saw it. A large blue ribbon, the symbol of first prize, was resting right next to her entry card. Her tomatoes! People were marveling at them, leaning in close to admire their size and color. One of the judges, a stout man with an impressive mustache, was speaking to a small group. "Never seen anything like it," he was saying. "The flavor is just, well, it's what a tomato is supposed to taste like. Perfect balance of acid and sugar. And the texture. Grew these in heaven's own soil, I'd wager." Agnes felt a dizzying wave of vindication. She saw Sterling push his way forward, his skepticism warring with his curiosity. He stared at the tomatoes, then at the name on the card. Parker Farm. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as a flicker of recognition, of dawning comprehension, crossed his face. He looked up, his gaze scanning the crowd, and for a moment, his eyes met Agnes's. The connection was electric. In that single, silent moment, he knew. He might not have understood the how, but he understood the what. He was looking at the fruits of his own arrogance. He saw the quiet, determined woman he had tried to bully, and he saw the impossible bounty she had created from the filth he had dumped on her land. He turned away abruptly, his face flushed, and disappeared into the crowd. Agnes didn't feel triumph, not in a gloating way. She just felt a deep, quiet rightness, as if a tilted world had finally been set straight. "The earth remembers," Arthur had said. "And it always, always repays." The journey home was quiet but filled with a buoyant, unspoken joy. The blue ribbon and the prize money, a sum that would pay the bank loan and see them through the winter, sat safely in a box on Agnes's lap. The win itself was sweet, but the true victory was quieter. It was the knowledge that she had not just survived, but thrived. She had taken the worst of what someone had thrown at her and turned it into the best thing she had ever grown. A week later, another buggy rolled up her lane. This time it was not Franklin Sterling, but her daughter. Sarah stepped down, looking uncertain. She had taken the train as soon as she'd heard the news, which had traveled faster than any telegraph. She looked around, at the neat, flourishing rows of the garden, at the sturdy, repaired fences, at the look of calm competence on her mother's face. She saw Leo and Jed sharing a joke by the barn. The farm was no longer the place of grim, undignified squalor she had imagined. It was alive, humming with purpose. "Mother," Sarah began, her voice thick with an emotion Agnes couldn't quite name. I was wrong. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a year's worth of misunderstanding. There were no grand apologies, just a quiet reconciliation over a cup of tea in the kitchen. Sarah held the blue ribbon in her hands, tracing the gold lettering with her finger. "I think Dad would be proud," she said softly. And for the first time in a long time, Agnes let herself believe it was true. A few days after that, a third visitor arrived. It was Franklin Sterling. He looked diminished, the arrogant swagger gone, replaced by a weary stoop in his shoulders. He stood by his buggy for a long time, just looking at the farm, before he finally approached the porch where Agnes was shelling beans. "Mrs. Parker," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "I came to ask, how?" His voice was low, stripped of its usual bluster. Agnes paused her work, looking out at the back field where the great compost pile, now much smaller, still stood. "You helped, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone even, without a trace of accusation. The words hung in the air. He followed her gaze, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in his mind. A slow flush crept up his neck. He understood everything. He told her his business was failing. A new, cleaner fish market had opened in the next town, and his reputation for being a careless, arrogant man was finally catching up to him. He was facing ruin. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for a partnership. He offered to deliver his fish scraps, cleanly, respectfully, and to pay her a fair price for them, in exchange for a share of her vegetables to feed his own family. It was a humble request from a humbled man. A year passed. The Parker farm was transformed. Sarah had decided to stay, her city life seeming pale and distant compared to the satisfaction of working the land. She and Leo, their easy camaraderie blossoming into something more, managed the expanding market garden, selling their now famous produce in 2 counties. Jed was a constant presence, his gruff wisdom a steadying influence. The partnership with Franklin Sterling held. Twice a week, his wagon would arrive, no longer dumping refuse, but delivering carefully sorted scraps for the new, orderly series of compost bins Jed had built. Sterling paid on time, every time, and his manner was always respectful, that of a man who had learned a hard lesson about the true cost of things. The farm was no longer a place of sorrow and struggle, but one of community and abundance. The house, once silent with grief, was now filled with the sounds of shared meals and easy laughter. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its wounds healed, its potential unlocked. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the fields, Agnes stood in her garden. The soil was rich and dark beneath her feet. She plunged her hands into it, feeling its cool, living texture. It was the same land that had defeated her husband, the same land her daughter had urged her to abandon. But it had been waiting, all this time, for someone to feed it, to understand its simple, profound truth. Buster came and nudged his head under her hand, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against her leg. She looked out at the vibrant rows of green, at the distant hills painted in hues of orange and purple. She had not outfought her adversary, she had outgrown him. She had learned that the most powerful forces are not anger or revenge, but patience and renewal. The earth remembers. It remembers neglect, and it remembers kindness. It takes what it is given, breaks it down to its essential parts, and gives it back, transformed. In the end, it always gives back.